Before we begin, take a second to like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear could reshape how you see global power. This is more than politics. This is family, identity, and the future of Black unity. China's worst fear is unfolding right now. A powerful alliance between Africa and African Americans, led by voices like Ibrahim Traoré, is breaking the cycle of dependency and creating a future that terrifies those who profit from our separation. Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about Africa and America. It's about all of us. 3 weeks ago, a late-night phone call shattered the calm in Ouagadougou. It lasted exactly 47 minutes. The caller spoke flawless English, but his voice trembled with unease. And here's the surprising part. The call didn't come from Washington, Paris, or London. It came from Beijing. On the line, a Chinese official addressed Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré, expressing deep concern about the growing partnerships between Africa and African Americans. These connections, he admitted, were beginning to unsettle powerful players who had invested heavily in Africa's future. For over 2 decades, while America neglected the continent and Europe clung to colonial habits, China rose quietly to become Africa's largest trading partner. They built railways, ports, roads, and factories. They lent billions in infrastructure loans, convincing African leaders they were different from Western powers. But beneath the glossy image of partnership, a different reality was unfolding, one that President Traoré himself had glimpsed years earlier. 5 years ago, as a young military officer at a security conference in Ghana, Traoré overheard a conversation between 2 Chinese officials. They assumed no one could understand their Mandarin, but he had learned enough during his training to catch their meaning. One complained about African demands for local jobs and technology transfer. The other's reply made his blood boil. Africans are excellent at consuming, but terrible at innovating. They'll always need us to build and manage their resources. The key is to keep them dependent. That moment revealed China's real strategy. What they called partnership was in truth a sophisticated form of economic colonialism. The system was simple: loans for infrastructure, but with conditions. Chinese firms won the contracts. Chinese workers filled the jobs. Chinese technology dominated the projects. And when African nations struggled to repay, Beijing gained leverage, sometimes even control, over the very assets it had built. China named it the Belt and Road Initiative. Traoré began calling it the Debt and Control Initiative. But what Beijing never anticipated was the awakening of Africa's vast diaspora. More than 50 million African Americans, with $1.6 trillion in purchasing power and centuries of innovation behind them, were starting to look homeward. That realization threw China's long-term strategy into disarray. 6 months ago, the first real shock came. A Chinese state-owned giant had spent years lobbying to secure a contract for a telecommunications network across West Africa. They invested millions in feasibility studies, confident the deal was theirs. Then Marcus Johnson, an African-American software engineer, entered the scene. Partnering with innovators in Nigeria, Ghana, and Burkina Faso, Johnson and his team designed telecom systems that were not only cheaper, but also more secure and adaptable to African realities. More importantly, they trained African engineers to maintain and upgrade the systems independently. When the contract was awarded to African-led companies backed by African-American expertise, Beijing experienced something unprecedented. They had lost not to Europe or America, but to Africans themselves. That defeat sent ripples through China's Africa policy establishment. For the first time in 2 decades, their dominance faced a new kind of challenger, an Africa reconnecting with its own diaspora. 2 months later, Beijing reached out to Traoré directly. They invited him to China, offering first-class flights, luxurious accommodations, and high-level meetings. But their intent was clear. They wanted to understand, and possibly contain, the new alliance forming between Africa and its global family. The discussions in Beijing were unlike those with Western officials. There were no lectures about democracy or demands for reforms. Instead, there was unease, a quiet recognition that the old balance of power in Africa was beginning to shift. And with every partnership forged between Africa and African Americans, China's carefully built foundation of influence seemed a little less stable. The conversations in Beijing quickly cut through pleasantries. During the very first meeting, China's foreign minister laid out his case. Over the past 2 decades, he said, we have invested more than 200 billion in Africa's development. We have built railways, roads, ports, and power plants. We have provided loans when Western banks refused. We have created jobs where Western companies would not. Then came the sentence that exposed Beijing's real anxiety. But now we hear that you are encouraging African Americans to invest in African infrastructure projects. We are concerned that inexperienced diaspora involvement might disrupt carefully planned strategies. The word inexperienced hung in the air. When asked to explain, the minister's response was telling. African Americans may succeed in business and technology in the United States, but they don't understand African realities. They lack the scale, the resources, and the expertise to manage development across an entire continent. But behind that statement was a deeper truth. China wasn't worried about African American inexperience. They were terrified of African American expertise. The evidence surfaced the next day. During a meeting with representatives from China's largest corporations, mining companies, telecom providers, banks, and construction giants. It was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 6. One after another, executives repeated the same story. African American professionals were arriving in Africa with networks, resources, and skills that Chinese firms could not match. A mining executive admitted, African American engineers are training locals to operate machinery we once claimed only Chinese technicians could handle. They're reducing our importance. A telecom representative complained. African American experts are helping African companies develop software that competes directly with ours. They are creating alternatives where we thought none existed. But the most revealing statement came from a financial services leader. They understand US markets and African needs. They're designing financial tools that serve people better than anything we can offer. They're making our services irrelevant. That was the moment China's fears became clear. For 20 years, they had carefully positioned themselves as Africa's only escape from Western dominance. They had built an image of being indispensable. But now, the African diaspora was proving there was another path. One rooted in African resources and African American expertise, creating authentically African solutions. Beijing understood the stakes, and soon, retaliation followed. 3 weeks after those meetings, African nations with growing diaspora partnerships began to encounter identical problems. Chinese-funded infrastructure projects stalled without explanation. Loan approvals that once flowed smoothly were suddenly frozen. Joint ventures between Chinese firms and African companies collapsed overnight, if those companies had African American partners. Even trade agreements began shifting. Nations deepening ties with African Americans suddenly faced harsher, costlier, and more restrictive terms from Beijing. The message was unmistakable. Choose dependency on China, or choose partnership with African Americans, but not both. What was unfolding was no longer just about development contracts or investments. It was an economic war for the soul of Africa's future. And in that war, China had overlooked one critical truth. The alliance between Africa and its diaspora was built not on dependency, but on shared identity, innovation, and independence. China assumed Africa would respond to economic pressure the same way it always had, by retreating, conceding, and accepting dependency. But this time they miscalculated. Instead of weakening the growing partnerships, Beijing's pressure only strengthened them. African American investors who once approached Africa cautiously suddenly realized they were not just exploring opportunities. They were stepping into a global contest for Africa's future. That awareness transformed everything. Dr. Keisha Williams, the renewable energy expert, captured this shift perfectly. When I first came to Africa, I thought I was just installing solar panels, she explained. Now I realize I'm part of a movement to free Africa from energy dependency of any kind. Within months, what began as scattered collaborations between African nations and African American professionals evolved into a coordinated economic front. Diaspora investors began prioritizing African ventures over other global opportunities. professionals started viewing African partnerships as career-defining missions rather than side projects. African American institutions stopped treating Africa as a charity case and started treating it as a strategic priority. Most importantly, information, resources, and strategies began to circulate across networks, multiplying impact far beyond the capacity of any individual effort. Then came the breakthrough. 6 months ago, Dr. Michael Thompson, a renowned African-American cardiovascular surgeon, was working with the Ministry of Health to design medical training programs. During one planning session, he posed a question that would alter the trajectory of African development. Instead of building isolated partnerships between individual countries and individual diaspora professionals, what if we created a continental African-American development network? What if every diaspora professional in Africa was connected? What if every African government working with the diaspora was linked together? That idea became the African Diaspora Development Network, the most ambitious Pan-African economic initiative in modern history. Within 3 months, professionals in 23 African countries were linked through shared platforms. Governments began coordinating diaspora-focused policies. Communication channels, resource-sharing systems, and collaborative strategies turned scattered projects into a unified movement. For the first time, Africa and its diaspora were acting as one economic bloc, something China had never anticipated. Beijing's reaction was immediate. At first, they tried to compete directly, ramping up investments, softening loan terms, and promising greater technology transfer. But money could not replicate cultural connection. Then they attempted to divide. Special deals were offered to African nations willing to limit diaspora ties. Lucrative incentives were dangled before African American entrepreneurs in Asia, hoping to lure them away from Africa. When division failed, China resorted to imitation. Chinese companies began hiring African Americans as consultants to simulate the partnerships they couldn't build organically. Institutions offered scholarships to African American students, attempting to cultivate loyalty to Chinese interests. But what they couldn't replicate was authenticity. They couldn't mimic the family bond that drives African Americans to Africa. They couldn't fabricate the pride felt when the diaspora contributes to Africa's success. And they could never reproduce the homecoming spirit that fuels African Americans to pour their best energy into the continent's future. That was the decisive moment. This wasn't just about economics anymore. Africa and its diaspora had demonstrated something far more powerful. Genuine relationships outlast strategic interests. What began as partnerships had become a movement, with implications far beyond Africa itself. The ripple effects of this movement are reshaping global power dynamics in ways that stretch far beyond African or African American communities. Every step Africa takes toward independence from Chinese infrastructure weakens Beijing's global reach. Every time African Americans choose to invest in Africa rather than elsewhere, capital flows into projects that strengthen black communities instead of foreign empires. And every collaboration between African nations and African American expertise creates models of development that other regions of the world can replicate. But perhaps the most profound change is not economic, it's psychological. For the first time in centuries, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic see themselves not as recipients of foreign aid, but as equal partners in shaping their own destiny. That psychological transformation is what truly unsettles China. Beijing's entire African strategy was built on the belief that dependency was inevitable, that Africans would always trade autonomy for development. What they never imagined was that Africans would remember they had family, skilled, resourced, and connected, who could make dependency obsolete. And this is the future China fears most. Picture an Africa where every major infrastructure project is conceived by African minds, guided by African American expertise, and constructed by African workers with technology designed for African needs. Picture universities across the continent rivaling the best in the world because they blend African knowledge with African American academic excellence. Picture companies that export not raw materials, but finished goods, backed by diaspora networks and global market access. Now picture African American communities that look first to Africa for international investments. Professionals who see African ventures as more rewarding than domestic ones. Institutions that treat Africa as a strategic priority, not a secondary option. That vision is not just development. It is the emergence of a global black economic power center, one with the capacity to rival China, Europe, or any regional bloc in both influence and cultural impact. China poured $200 billion into Africa over 2 decades to prevent exactly this outcome. Yet it is unfolding anyway, powered by resources and connections Beijing neither anticipated nor can replicate. And so we stand at a decisive crossroads. China's position is clear. They will deploy every weapon available: economic pressure, diplomatic influence, and strategic competition to preserve their dominance in Africa and block African-American cooperation. But the choice before Africa and its diaspora is equally clear. We can surrender to intimidation and slip back into dependency. Or we can accelerate collaboration until it becomes unstoppable. We can accept the myth that African progress requires foreign control. Or we can prove that Africa's development is strongest when led by African minds in partnership with African American power. At this crossroads, the question is simple. Will we keep competing for seats in systems designed by others? Or will we build our own systems, ones that reflect our values and serve our communities? This is not just an economic decision. It is a question of identity, dignity, and the legacy we leave for generations to come. And so, a direct message must be delivered to the African American community. To our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic, your partnership with Africa carries meaning far beyond business. Every dollar invested in African projects is not just capital, it is liberation for 1.3 billion people from dependency on foreign powers that have never had Africa's best interests at heart. Every time you share expertise with African communities, you are not merely transferring knowledge, you are proving that Africans can master every field of human achievement. And when you prioritize Africa over other international opportunities, you are not making routine business decisions. You are participating in the most significant realignment of global power since the end of colonial rule. China already understands this. That is why Beijing fears this alliance. That is why it resists so fiercely. The real question is, do we understand it ourselves? Do we recognize that the skills and success earned in America can now be used to transform Africa? Do we see that Africa's unmatched resources and rising potential can unlock opportunities America has never provided? This brings us to the final challenge. Beyond individual success, beyond national development, lies a deeper test. Can a scattered people reunite? Can centuries of division and trauma be healed? Can authentic cooperation prove stronger than the calculated strategies of global powers? If we rise to this challenge, the world will see that black excellence is not an isolated achievement to be celebrated, but a foundation strong enough to build entire civilizations upon. When African families, separated by oceans and centuries, work together again, they create possibilities no external power can stop or replicate. China is terrified of this because it understands the potential better than many of us do. They see what happens when African resources merge with African American expertise, economic independence that makes their influence unnecessary. But there is more at stake than economics. What is emerging is the possibility of a global black renaissance, an age of cultural rebirth, technological innovation, and social transformation that can benefit all of humanity. The choice is before us. We can allow fear of retaliation to shrink our ambitions, or we can let the vision of unity expand our possibilities beyond anything the world has seen. The call is not for saviors to come to Africa. The call is for brothers and sisters to come home, to build with family, and to show the world what authentic partnership truly looks like. The future is calling, and the very fact that China trembles at this movement is proof we are walking the right path. Because in the end, what is unfolding is larger than economics, larger than politics, larger than any single nation's ambitions. It is a truth written in blood and memory that family bonds will always outlast strategic calculations. It proves that authentic cooperation will always outweigh manufactured dependency. And when Black people unite across continents, we create possibilities so powerful they unsettle those who profit from keeping us apart. If this vision resonates with you, if you see in it the potential for your own life, your family, and your community, then share it. Because this conversation is bigger than Africa and bigger than America. It is about what happens when a scattered people finally remember the truth. We were never truly divided.